In a gleaming Manhattan penthouse, where the air was thick with the scent of money and silent deals, the red wine bled across Clara's simple white uniform like a mortal wound. It wasn't an accident. The senator, a man whose smile never reached his cold, dismissive eyes, had done it with a contemptuous smirk, a casual display of power. He tossed a crumpled napkin at her feet, his voice a low command meant for the entire room to hear. "Clean my shoes." A hush fell over the glittering assembly of wolves in tailored suits. They watched, their faces masks of detached curiosity, waiting for the inevitable tears, the humiliated apology. For a moment, she was just a girl drowning under the weight of their judgment, a ghost in a palace of glass. But what happened in that silent room would change everything. And if you watch until the end, you'll discover how a single word can bring down an empire. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments what you would have done. Clara, at 28, was a server for the night, not by choice, but by a crushing necessity that had a name: Lily. Her younger sister's medical bills were a mountain she climbed every day, and this job, with its promise of a generous tip, was supposed to be a small foothold. She carried herself with a quiet grace, a shield forged in a life that had taught her resilience the hard way. She was an expert at being invisible, at fading into the background, but tonight a powerful man had decided to make her the center of his cruel stage. The world around her was a symphony of opulence she couldn't comprehend. The low, confident hum of conversations about mergers and acquisitions, the delicate clinking of crystal glasses filled with champagne that cost more than her rent, the way light from the chandeliers fractured across the polished marble floors, it all felt alien. Her reality was the worn-out linoleum of a hospital corridor and the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Here, she moved with practiced precision, her steps silent, her posture perfect, a carefully constructed dance of servitude. Each tray she carried felt heavier than the last, a physical manifestation of the chasm between their world and hers, a gilded cage where she was merely part of the decor. Her solitude was a constant companion, a hollow ache in her chest that grew sharper in crowded rooms like this one. While these people celebrated their victories, her mind was miles away, in a sterile room where her sister fought a silent battle. That image was her anchor and her deepest vulnerability. These men, with their easy laughter and expensive watches, traded fortunes with a single handshake, utterly oblivious to the wars waged by people like her for one more day of hope. The stark contrast between their casual power and her desperate struggle was a bitter pill, a constant suffocating reminder of the world's profound indifference and the injustice that felt woven into its very fabric. The senator's gaze pinned her in place, cold and reptilian. He was enjoying this, savoring the public spectacle of her humiliation. The dark stain on her uniform was a mark of his contempt, a brand of her insignificance. The napkin at her feet was not an offering, but a command to kneel, to surrender her last shred of dignity for his amusement. The silence in the room thickened, becoming a physical pressure, the collective weight of their expectation. They were all waiting for her to break, to perform the role he had assigned her, the worthless girl who knew her place. In his eyes, she was already on her knees, already defeated, already nothing. For a split second, the exhaustion nearly won. The thought of Lily's tired smile, the fear of losing this job, the sheer weight of it all, urged her to submit. It would be so much easier to just bend, to wipe the stain away, and disappear back into the shadows. But then a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her mother's voice, a warm whisper from a life long gone, telling her that pride was the only jewel they could ever truly own. Her spine straightened in a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that felt like an earthquake inside her. Her gaze, once fixed on the floor, slowly lifted to meet the senator's. It was not a look of defiance or anger, but of a calm, unbreakable certainty. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped, so quiet it was almost lost in the vast silent room, yet it landed with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. No, it hung in the air, a fragile, impossible act of rebellion. Before the senator's shock could curdle into rage, she felt a change in the room's energy, a sudden drop in temperature. From a dark, unassuming corner of the penthouse, a gaze settled on her. It was not like the others. This gaze was heavy, ancient, and unnervingly still, like a falcon watching its territory from a great height. She didn't know the man in the shadows, but a cold dread told her his silent attention was infinitely more dangerous than the senator's public scorn. The city was still breathing its cold, gray dawn when Clara's day began. The shrill cry of her bedside alarm clock was a daily violence, pulling her from dreams that were softer than her reality. Her small apartment, perched above a street that never truly slept, was a sanctuary of solitude, filled with the ghosts of unpaid bills and the lingering scent of yesterday's reheated coffee. She moved with an economy of motion born from perpetual exhaustion, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. Her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a woman whose eyes held a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. It was a soul-deep fatigue, the kind that comes from fighting a war no one else can see, a battle waged in the quiet moments before the world demanded she put on her armor. Her commute was a descent into a different kind of anonymity, a crowded bus where she was just another tired body pressed against a cold window. Outside, Manhattan's steel and glass giants scraped a sky that seemed indifferent to the struggles happening below. She watched the faces around her, blank, resigned, lost in their own silent battles, and felt a profound, aching connection to their shared invisibility. Each stop brought on more people, each with their own weight, their own unspoken burdens. The journey was a daily reminder of her place in the city's unforgiving hierarchy, a small, moving part in a vast machine that would replace her without a second thought. She clutched the worn strap of her bag, a small anchor in a sea of strangers, her thoughts already on the long hours ahead. The diner where she worked smelled of stale grease and desperation. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, a man whose smiles were as thin as his hairline, watched her from his perch by the cash register, his eyes cataloging every perceived flaw. He thrived on small cruelties, a clipped remark about her speed, a condescending tone when she asked a question that chipped away at her dignity piece by piece. Clara navigated the tight spaces between tables with a practiced grace, her movements fluid and efficient. She served lukewarm coffee and forced smiles, her mind a fortress where she kept her true self safe. The uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen better days, felt like a second skin, a costume of servitude she had to wear to survive, in a world that only valued what it could take from you. The pressure was a constant, physical weight in her chest. It lived in the vibrating phone in her pocket, where texts from the hospital's billing department would appear like clockwork. It was in the way she counted her tips at the end of a shift, her heart sinking with the realization that it was never enough. Lily's face, captured in a faded photograph tucked into her wallet, was both her reason and her torment. Her sister's smile was a beacon of light in her bleak world, but the cost of keeping that light from fading was a debt that grew with every passing day. The ticking of the large clock on the diner wall seemed to mock her, each second a reminder of time she was losing, of money she didn't have, of a promise she was terrified she couldn't keep. Yet, even in the suffocating gloom of her routine, her spirit refused to be extinguished. One afternoon, she saw Mr. Henderson berating a new busboy, a young kid barely out of his teens, his eyes welling with tears over a tray of shattered plates. While others looked away, pretending not to notice, Clara stepped between them. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at her boss and said, "It was my fault. I bumped into him." She took the blame, and the pay deduction that came with it, without hesitation. It was a small act of rebellion, a quiet defense of someone even more vulnerable than herself. In that moment, she wasn't just a server. She was a guardian of a forgotten kindness, a flicker of integrity in a world built on casual cruelty.
Her visits to the hospital were a pilgrimage to the only thing that mattered. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the hallways, the soft, rhythmic beep of the machines connected to Lily, these were the sounds of her life's true purpose. She would sit by her sister's bed for hours, reading aloud from old dog-eared books or simply holding her hand, her touch a silent promise to never give up. In these quiet moments, the crushing weight of her life would recede, replaced by a fierce, protective love that was both her greatest strength and her most profound vulnerability. She would watch Lily's chest rise and fall, a fragile rhythm she would do anything to protect, and the world outside the hospital room, with all its noise and injustice, would cease to exist. The conversation with Dr. Evans was brief, clinical, and devastating. He spoke of a new experimental treatment, a last hope wrapped in terrifying statistics and an astronomical price tag. He used words like aggressive and prohibitive, but all Clara heard was the sound of a door slamming shut. The number he quoted was an impossible sum, a figure so far beyond her reach it felt like a cruel joke. She walked out of his office in a daze, the sterile white walls of the hospital closing in on her. The hope that had kept her going for so long began to fray, leaving behind a cold, raw despair. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with the vast, empty chasm of failure yawning below her. That evening, another waitress at the diner, a woman named Maria, with tired eyes and a kind heart, mentioned an opportunity. A high-end catering agency was looking for extra staff for a one-night event. The location, a penthouse in the sky, the clientele were the city's untouchable elite, and the pay was a fortune, more than she could make in 2 months at the diner. Maria spoke of it in a hushed, cautionary tone, warning of the kind of men who attended these gatherings.
Clara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. It was a world she had no desire to enter, a place where people like her were either invisible or prey. But the doctor's words echoed in her mind, drowning out her fear with the louder, more urgent voice of desperation. Staring at the eviction notice that had been slipped under her door, the doctor's number scrawled on a piece of paper beside it, she knew she had no choice. The abstract fear of a dangerous world was nothing compared to the concrete terror of losing Lily. With a trembling hand, she picked up her phone and made the call. The voice on the other end was crisp and impersonal as she accepted the job. In that moment, she felt a profound shift inside her, as if she was stepping across an invisible line. She was trading a piece of her quiet, guarded world for a chance, a gamble against impossible odds. It was a deal made not with a person, but with fate itself. And she had a chilling premonition that the cost would be far higher than a single night of her time. An hour later, she stood before her cracked mirror, dressed in the agency's uniform, a simple, stark white blouse and a black skirt. It was clean, crisp, and fit her perfectly, yet it felt alien against her skin, a costume for a role she was not prepared to play. It was nothing like her worn diner dress. This uniform was a symbol of a different kind of servitude, one performed in palaces of glass under the gaze of kings and predators. She looked at the stranger in the mirror, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she turned away from her reflection and walked out the door, her steady footsteps carrying her toward the gleaming tower, where her destiny and a man cloaked in shadows. He rose from the shadows not with a sudden movement, but like a force of nature gathering itself. Julian Falcone was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him, his presence a void in the glittering room. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored suit the color of a moonless night, he moved with an unnerving economy of motion, each step silent on the marble floor. The confident hum of the party died in his wake, replaced by a thick, reverent silence. Men who commanded fortunes with a single phone call averted their gazes, their power rendered meaningless by the quiet authority of his approach. He was not a guest,
He was the center of gravity around which this entire world of wealth and influence secretly orbited, a king in a kingdom of whispers. His face was a study in controlled severity, handsome in a way that was more dangerous than charming. High cheekbones carved a stark landscape, and his mouth was a firm, uncompromising line. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were a deep, cold gray, like a winter sea, and they saw everything. As he moved closer, Clara noticed a faint silver scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a relic of a violence his elegant exterior was designed to conceal. It was the only imperfect thing about him, a small crack in a flawless facade that hinted at the man beneath the myth, a man who had bled and survived. This single flaw made him terrifyingly human, a predator who understood pain intimately. He did not spare the senator a glance. His entire focus, heavy and absolute, landed on Clara. It was not a look of pity or lust, but of intense, unnerving assessment. She felt as if he were seeing past her stained uniform and tired eyes, peering directly into the core of her being, at the fear, the exhaustion, and the stubborn flicker of defiance that had made her say no. Under his gaze, she felt stripped bare, her quiet life and all its struggles laid open for his inspection. A tremble ran through her, a primal fear of being seen so completely by a man whose world was built on secrets and shadows. It was the most terrifying and profound connection she had ever felt with another person. Finally, his gaze shifted, moving from her to the senator with a glacial slowness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. When Julian Falcone spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute command, a low, level tone that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. He paused, letting the implication settle like a shroud over the senator. Leave. It was not a request or a threat, it was a verdict. In that single word, the senator's power, his influence, and his public standing were erased, rendered obsolete by a man who answered to no law but his own. The senator, a man accustomed to commanding respect, paled. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Julian's unblinking eyes. There was no room for negotiation in that gaze, no mercy. With a choked sound, the politician turned and fled, his retreat a clumsy, humiliating spectacle that the assembled guests watched with a mixture of fear and relief. He was a ghost being exorcised from a sacred space. Clara remained frozen, caught in the eye of the storm Julian had created for her, a silent, terrifying vortex from which there was no escape. She understood then that she had been saved by something far more dangerous than what had threatened her.
With the senator gone, the crushing silence of the room remained, all eyes now fixed on her and the man who stood beside her. Julian's attention returned to Clara, his proximity a tangible force that made the air between them feel thick and charged. He didn't touch her, yet she felt his presence like a brand, a claim. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing trapped in a cage. She was terrified of him, of the casual, absolute power he wielded, but beneath the fear was a strange, bewildering current of safety. For the first time all night, she felt anchored, as if this dark, silent man was the only solid thing in a world of glittering illusions. He gestured with a subtle inclination of his head toward an empty chair at his secluded table in the corner. "Sick," he said, his voice still low and even. "No one will bother you again tonight." It was a promise sealed with the full weight of his reputation. Clara found herself moving without conscious thought, her body responding to his command as if it were an immutable law of physics. She sank into the plush leather of the chair, the cool material a stark contrast to the heat flooding her veins. From this vantage point, in his territory, the opulent party seemed distant and unreal, a tableau of powerful people who were now all terrified of the woman he had chosen to protect.
She sat under his watchful gaze, the silence stretching between them, more intimate and revealing than any conversation could be. He didn't ask her name or why she had defied the senator. He simply observed her, his expression unreadable, his stillness a form of intense communication. She found the courage to meet his eyes and saw something flicker in their depths, not warmth, but a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of a world that breaks you if you let it. In that moment, she felt a terrifying kinship with this man, a sense that he recognized the iron in her soul because he was forged from the same unyielding material. He stayed for 10 minutes that felt like an eternity. He did not eat or drink, his purpose seemingly fulfilled. He then gave a nearly imperceptible nod to a man standing discreetly by the far wall, a silent order given and received. Without another word to her, Julian Falcone rose and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had emerged as seamlessly as he had appeared. The room slowly began to breathe again, the low hum of conversation cautiously returning, but the energy had been fundamentally altered. The space he had occupied now felt cold, a vacuum of power that no one dared to fill. Clara remained at his table, an untouchable ghost in a palace of glass. The scent of his cologne, a subtle, expensive mix of sandalwood and something cold like winter air, lingered around her, a phantom presence. She was no longer just a server, she was the woman the Falcon had protected. The wine stain on her uniform was no longer a mark of humiliation, but a symbol of her impossible encounter. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her life had been irrevocably fractured. That single word, no, had not saved her. It had thrown her from the predictable misery of her world into the orbit of a man whose protection was a gilded cage. The days that followed were a dissonant echo of her former life. Clara moved through the familiar motions, brewing coffee at the diner, walking the sterile hospital corridors, lying awake in her silent apartment, but the world felt tilted on its axis. The memory of the penthouse, of Julian Falcone's cold, assessing eyes, was a ghost that followed her everywhere. The clatter of cheap ceramic plates at the diner sounded jarring after the delicate chime of crystal. She found herself searching for a black town car in every reflection, her body tensed for a threat she couldn't name. The quiet desperation of her old life had been replaced by a new, more profound unease, the feeling of being a pawn in a game whose rules she would never understand. She tried to erase him from her thoughts, to dismiss the encounter as a bizarre, isolated incident. She focused on Lily, on the mounting bills, on the grinding fear that was her constant companion. But his presence lingered, an invisible ink staining the pages of her routine. One afternoon, leaving the hospital after a long, draining visit with her sister, she saw it. A sleek, black sedan was parked across the street, its tinted windows obscuring the occupant. It was too expensive, too immaculate for this part of town. Her heart seized in her chest. For a split second, she thought she saw the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat, perfectly still, watching. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the car pulled away, melting silently into the city traffic. It could have been a coincidence. She repeated the word to herself like a mantra, a desperate attempt to reclaim the simple, predictable nature of her world. But she knew it wasn't. The feeling of being watched was a physical sensation, a cold weight between her shoulder blades. He was observing her, not with the predatory hunger of the senator, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity, like a collector studying a rare, fragile artifact. This silent surveillance was a new kind of violation, a subtle intrusion into the small, private world she had fought so hard to protect. She felt trapped, not by walls, but by his omnipresent gaze, a gilded cage whose bars were invisible but no less real.
A week later, he stepped out of the shadows and into her world. She was walking home from a late shift, the rain-slicked pavement reflecting the city's weary neon glow. A car pulled up beside her, its engine a low, powerful hum. The back window slid down, revealing Julian Falcone's impassive face. "Get in, Clara," he said. It wasn't a question. His use of her name sent a fresh wave of fear through her. He knew her name. He knew where she worked, where she lived. She hesitated, the rain soaking through her thin coat, her mind racing. To refuse was to defy him, an act whose consequences she couldn't begin to imagine. To accept was to step willingly into his darkness. She got in. The car's interior was a world of silent luxury, the scent of leather and cold rain filling the air. He sat opposite her, the space between them charged with a heavy, unspoken tension. He didn't speak for several blocks, simply watching the city lights slide across her pale face. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything he wasn't saying, with the power he held over her life. She felt small and breakable in his presence, yet there was a part of her, a foolish, curious part, that was not entirely afraid. She was seeing the man behind the myth, and his solitude felt as vast and profound as the city itself. "Your sister," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. The new treatment inexpensive. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same detached precision he had used to dismiss the senator. Clara's blood ran cold. He knew about Lily. He knew about the experimental treatment, about the impossible sum that haunted her waking moments. This was no longer just observation. It was a deep, invasive knowledge of her most private vulnerabilities. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes giving nothing away, and in his silence she found her answer. He knew because he made it his business to know everything. She wanted to hate him for it, for peeling back the layers of her life with such casual omniscience. His knowledge was a weapon, a demonstration of his reach and her powerlessness. Yet, as she looked at him, she saw something else in his guarded expression, a flicker of something that wasn't cruelty. It was a deep, ancient weariness, the look of a man who carried the weight of 1,000 grim realities. She began to see that his power was also his prison, isolating him behind walls of fear and secrets. For the first time, she felt a sliver of empathy for this dangerous, lonely man, a feeling so contradictory and terrifying it made her dizzy. He dropped her off a block from her apartment, the car melting back into the night as silently as it had appeared. She stood on the wet pavement, her heart pounding, the warmth of the car's heater still clinging to her skin. The encounter had changed something fundamental between them. He was no longer just a myth or a shadow. He was a man who knew her deepest fears and sorrows. And she was no longer just a girl he had saved. She was a puzzle he was methodically, relentlessly solving. The line between fear and fascination blurred, leaving her stranded in a disorienting gray space, terrified of him and yet inexplicably drawn to the humanity she sensed beneath the ice. Julian returned to his own penthouse, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the city that was his kingdom. But the usual sense of control and order eluded him. Her face, her wide, honest eyes filled with a mixture of terror and defiance, was imprinted on his mind. Her quiet dignity was a stark contrast to the grasping, sycophantic people who populated his world. She was real in a way nothing had been for years. He found himself replaying their brief conversation, the way her voice trembled but didn't break. She was a flicker of light in his perpetual twilight, and the sight of her both soothed a part of him he thought was dead and threatened the cold discipline that kept him alive. He had built his empire on a foundation of ruthless logic and emotional detachment. Feelings were a liability, a weakness to be exploited in others and purged from oneself. Yet this girl, with her worn coat and fierce love for her sister, was dismantling his defenses without even trying. He had ordered the background check on her out of a cold, calculated need to understand the anomaly she represented. But reading the details of her life, her quiet struggles, her small acts of kindness, her unwavering integrity, had stirred something else. It was a ghost of respect, a dangerous, unfamiliar emotion that felt like a crack forming in the armor around his heart. His men were confused by his sudden interest in a waitress. They saw her as a loose end, a potential vulnerability. His most trusted advisor, an old man named Marco, with eyes that had seen too much, had cautioned him. "A girl like that, boss," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper.
She's from another world. Bringing her into ours will only destroy her. Julian knew Marco was right. He should have left her alone after that night, let her fade back into the anonymity of the city. But the thought of her being crushed by the world's casual cruelty, of her light being extinguished by a pile of medical bills, was an unbearable dissonance he felt compelled to correct.
He found himself driving through her neighborhood, a place of brick tenements and struggling storefronts he hadn't set foot in for decades. It was a world he had escaped, a life he had clawed his way out of. Seeing it again through the prism of her existence felt different. He saw not just the poverty and the struggle, but the resilience, the quiet dignity of people living on the edge. He saw Clara in the faces of the women hurrying home with groceries, in the determined set of a young man's jaw. He was seeing the world through her eyes, and it was a perspective that was both painful and profoundly humanizing, a reminder of the man he had been before he became the Falcon. Their next encounter was an accident, a genuine twist of fate in a series of calculated moves. She was at a small, independent bookstore, her fingers tracing the spines of old classics, a rare moment of peace she had stolen for herself. He was there to meet an informant in the cafe next door. He saw her through the window, her expression soft and unguarded as she read a line from a book. And for a moment, she was not a problem to be managed or a curiosity to be studied. She was just a woman, beautiful in her quiet solitude. He felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic force that overrode every instinct for caution and control. He walked into the bookstore. The tiny bell above the door announced his arrival, and her head snapped up. The color drained from her face as she saw him, her brief moment of peace shattered. He saw the fear in her eyes, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was the monster in her story, the shadow that blotted out her light. He stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in a gesture that was meant to be placating but felt inadequate. "I'm not here for you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's a coincidence." But they both knew the word had lost all meaning between them. She clutched the book to her chest like a shield. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "just leave me alone." The plea was so simple, so raw, it cut through his layers of control. It was the one thing he was finding himself incapable of doing. He wanted to tell her that his world was dangerous, that Marco was right, that she should run as far away from him as she could. But he also wanted to tell her that he would never let anything harm her, that he would burn the world down to keep her safe. The two impulses warred within him, a silent, violent conflict that left him paralyzed. The threat, when it came, was not from his world, but from hers. She left the diner late one night to find her boss, Mr. Henderson, waiting for her in the alley, his face twisted in a drunken, leering smile. He blocked her path, his beery breath hot on her face as he spewed insults about the deducted pay, about her arrogance. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, grabbing her arm. "You're nothing." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Clara. But before she could scream, the alley was flooded with the blinding white light of headlights. A black car had turned into the narrow space, its engine a low, menacing growl. Mr. Henderson froze, his hand dropping from her arm as he shielded his eyes. The car did not move. It simply sat there, a silent, hulking predator in the darkness. No one got out, no window came down, but the message was terrifyingly clear. Julian was there. He was always there. After a long, tense moment, Henderson stumbled backward and fled. The car remained for another minute before its lights went out, plunging the alley back into darkness. It then reversed slowly and was gone. Clara was left alone, trembling not from the confrontation, but from the chilling, absolute certainty of his protection. He had saved her again, but this time she understood his protection was a chain, each link forged from her own vulnerability. The call came on a burner phone he had sent her, delivered in a plain box with no return address.
His voice was a low command, giving her an address and a time, nothing more. It was a restaurant in Tribeca, its windows dark, its ornate doors locked to the world. She was led through a silent kitchen into the main dining room, a vast, empty space where 100 ghost conversations seemed to hang in the air. Julian was waiting at a single table set for two, a lone island in a sea of white linen. The room was lit only by the city's glow filtering through the tall windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. She felt like a pawn being moved into the center of the board, her purpose unknown, her fate entirely in his hands. He rose as she approached, a gesture of old-world formality that felt utterly at odds with the chilling power of the situation. He didn't smile. He simply watched her, his gray eyes tracking her every hesitant step. "You came," he stated, as if there had ever been a choice. He pulled out her chair, and she sat, her body rigid with a fear so profound it was almost silent. The space between them at the small table felt both immense and suffocatingly intimate. He knew her fears, her secrets, her deepest vulnerabilities. Here, in his world, under his gaze, she was completely transparent, her carefully constructed walls of quiet dignity dissolving into nothing. She felt a terrifying sense of inevitability, as if every moment of her life had been leading to this silent candlelight interrogation.
Without a word, he pushed a thick, cream-colored envelope across the table. Her name was written on it in a sharp, precise script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was not a letter, but stacks of crisp, new bills. It was an impossible sum, enough to cover Lily's treatment, enough to buy her sister a future. She looked up at him, her throat tight with a mixture of shock, gratitude, and a deep, gut-wrenching dread. "I can't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "This is a debt," he said, his voice flat and devoid of charity. "One you will repay." He was not offering her a gift, he was purchasing a leash, binding her to him with the one thing she could never refuse, hope for her sister's life. Before she could respond, the grand doors of the restaurant swung open with a violent bang, shattering the fragile silence. A man strode in, flanked by two others. He was handsome, dressed in a suit as fine as Julian's, but his charisma was edged with a viper's menace. He smiled, a wide, predatory expression that didn't touch his dark eyes. "Falcone," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Dining alone, or have you finally developed a taste for something other than revenge?" His gaze landed on Clara, and his smile widened, becoming something uglier, more possessive. He saw her not as a person, but as a weakness, a new, unexplored flank in his war against the man across from her. The man, who Julian called Serrano, sauntered toward their table, circling it like a shark. "Is this her?" he purred, his eyes raking over Clara with insolent appraisal. "The little sparrow you plucked from the gutter. I've heard the whispers, the great falcon, brought to heel by a pretty face and a sob story." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant to unnerve. "Tell me, does she know what kind of monster she's having dinner with? Does she know how many men you've buried to sit in this chair?" He was not speaking to her, but through her, using her presence as a scalpel to carve into Julian's legendary composure, to expose him in front of his new, fragile liability. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but something inside her, that same unyielding core that had said no to the senator, refused to break. She looked not at Serrano, but at Julian. His face was a mask of cold fury, his control absolute but stretched taut like a wire about to snap. And in that moment she did the unthinkable. She broke her own sacred rule of survival. She spoke. "You're wrong," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through Serrano's venom. "He is not the monster in this room."
It was a simple, impossible declaration of loyalty, an act of faith in the man who terrified her, a choice made in an instant that would seal her fate forever. Serrano's laughter was a harsh, ugly sound. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. Brave little sparrow. But he never touched her. In a movement so fast it was a blur, Julian was on his feet, his body a solid wall between them. He didn't push her or yell, he simply moved to stand in front of her, shielding her completely. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip her arm, pulling her firmly behind him. The contact was a shock, a jolt of heat and raw possession that stole the air from her lungs. It was not a gesture of affection, it was a claim, a silent, irrevocable declaration made before an enemy that this woman was his to protect. Julian's gaze was fixed on Serrano, and the cold discipline was gone, replaced by something ancient and lethal. "If you ever look at her again," he said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that promised absolute annihilation, "if you even breathe her name, I will dismantle your entire world while you watch, and then I will take you apart, piece by piece." He had broken his most sacred code. He had let an enemy see his heart. He had revealed his vulnerability, and in doing so, transformed it into the most terrifying weapon in his arsenal. Serrano's smug expression dissolved into a flicker of genuine fear. He saw the truth in Julian's eyes and knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Serrano and his men backed away slowly, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. They vanished through the doors, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more charged than before. Julian stood for a long moment with his back to her, his shoulders rigid, the controlled violence of the encounter still vibrating in the air around him. Clara could feel the tremor in the hand that was still gripping her arm, a testament to the iron will it took for him not to kill the man who had threatened her. In his stillness, she saw the terrible truth of his world, that protection was a declaration of war, and his shield was also her cage. She had seen the falcon, and he was more terrifying and more human than she had ever imagined. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, he turned to face her. The mask of the untouchable crime lord was gone, shattered. In its place was the face of a man laid bare, his eyes holding a storm of emotions he had suppressed for a lifetime: rage, guilt, and a fierce, terrifying protectiveness. He looked at her, and she saw that her small act of courage had undone him more completely than any enemy ever could. He had protected her, and in doing so had exposed the one thing he could never afford to have: a soul.
And she, in turn, saw him not as a savior or a monster, but as a man trapped in a war with himself. The silence stretched between them, a fragile bridge over an impossible chasm, and they both knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The drive back to her apartment was a journey through a vacuum. Julian sat in the opposite seat, a statue carved from shadow and silence, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window as the city's lights bled into abstract streaks of color. The air in the car was thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of his violence and the terrifying reality of her new gilded cage. He didn't look at her, not once. When the car stopped a block from her building, the silence was more profound than any sound. He gave a slight nod to the driver, and the door opened. She stepped out into the cold, wet night, the envelope of money clutched in her hand, a heavy, impossible anchor. The door clicked shut with a sound of utter finality, and the black sedan disappeared, leaving her alone on the pavement with the weight of her salvation. He returned to his penthouse, the sprawling view of the city he commanded now feeling like the architecture of his own isolation. He poured a glass of amber liquid, but left it untouched on the marble bar, the ice slowly dying in the silence. The confrontation with Serrano had been a catastrophic miscalculation, a breach of a lifetime of disciplined control. He picked up a secure phone and dialed a single number. When Marco answered, Julian's voice was devoid of all warmth, stripped down to the cold mechanics of command. "She is no longer my concern. Make sure the word spreads. Make it known that the debt is settled and the association is over." He paused, his own words a betrayal. "And watch her. From a distance so great she never feels it. Keep her safe from me." Clara spent that night sitting on her worn sofa, the envelope on the coffee table like a ticking bomb. Sleep was an impossibility. Her small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage, its quiet amplifying the frantic beating of her heart. She replayed the moment he had stood between her and Serrano, the raw, possessive grip of his hand on her arm, the lethal promise in his voice. It was a protection so absolute it felt like a form of annihilation. She had been saved by a monster, and in her moment of foolish loyalty, she had given him a new weapon to wield against his enemies, herself. She felt branded by the encounter, a silent accomplice to a world whose currency was fear and whose language was violence. The next morning, she walked into the hospital's administrative office and paid for the entire course of treatment. The transaction was sterile, professional, the clerk's polite smile a grotesque counterpoint to the turmoil in Clara's soul. The immense relief she had dreamed of for months never came. Instead, a cold, heavy guilt settled in her stomach. This money, this miracle that would save Lily's life, was stained. She sat by her sister's bed, listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitor, each pulse a reminder of the dark pact she had made. The hope she had bought felt like a poison, a slow-acting venom that saved the body by compromising the soul. She was living a lie, funded by the very darkness she had once so clearly defined herself against. The silence that followed was absolute. The black cars vanished from her periphery. The unnerving sensation of being watched was gone, and its absence left a void, a hollow ache that was more unsettling than the fear had been. Her old life resumed its predictable, grueling rhythm, but she moved through it like a phantom. The diner, the crowded bus, the lonely apartment, it was all a familiar landscape now seen through a stranger's eyes. He had returned her to her world, but the experience had fundamentally changed her perception of its borders. She understood now that her cage had never been about poverty. It had been about innocence. And he, in saving her, had taken that from her forever. A week later, whispers of a war in the city's underworld reached the surface world. A small article buried in the back pages of the newspaper spoke of a series of unfortunate accidents and suspected arson that had crippled the operations of a prominent import-export business. The name Serrano was never mentioned, but Clara knew. A deep, visceral chill traced its way down her spine as she read the clinical prose. This was the fallout. This was the silent, brutal response to a single insolent look. This was the cost of his protection, a price paid in fire and blood by men she would never know, a consequence of a battle she had inadvertently started with a single, quiet word of defiance. Staring out her window as a cold autumn rain wept against the glass, she finally saw the truth with a painful, crystalline clarity. Julian Falcone had not abandoned her. He had performed the most difficult act of all. He had cut her out of his life to save her from it. His withdrawal was not a rejection, but a shield, his silence a fortress built to keep his darkness from consuming her light. The fear she had felt for him, the moral outrage, the confusion, it all coalesced into a single devastating emotion. A deep and aching empathy for the man who had to become a monster to protect the one flicker of humanity he had allowed himself to touch. In his glass tower high above the city, Julian became a colder, more ruthless version of himself. He moved through his world with a chilling efficiency, his decisions sharp and final, his presence more intimidating than ever. He purged any perceived weakness from his organization, reinforcing the walls of his empire with fear and steel. He was re-establishing the myth, burying the man. But at night, when the city became a tapestry of distant lights, his gaze would invariably drift toward the quadrant where she lived. He had built a perfect, impenetrable fortress to keep her safe, but he now found himself on the outside, a king exiled from the only part of his kingdom that had ever felt real. One evening, a small, unmarked box appeared outside her apartment door. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a single, worn, leather-bound copy of a book of sonnets. There was no card, no message, no hint of the sender. But as she opened it, a single, perfectly preserved pressed gardenia fell from its pages. The gesture was a ghost's whisper across an impassable divide. It was an acknowledgement, a confession, and a farewell, all at once. It spoke of a beauty and a gentleness that his world could never allow, a final, silent message that communicated everything his voice never could. It was an apology for the cage and a prayer for the bird he had been forced to set free. Clara clutched the book to her chest, the faint, sweet scent of the flower a melancholic ghost in the air. At the hospital, Lily was responding to the treatment, her future a fragile, budding hope. Clara's world was, by all measures, saved, but a profound silence had taken root in her soul. It was the echo of his absence, the weight of a bond forged in fear and sealed in sacrifice. She was safe, she was solvent, she was free, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that a part of her would forever be a prisoner of his protection, living in the long, dark shadow of the man who had saved her life by erasing himself from it. Months bled into a year, a quiet passage of time that healed some wounds and turned others into faint, silvery scars. Lily's laughter, once a fragile echo in a sterile hospital room, now filled their small, sunlit apartment. Clara had found a new life, a quiet existence working in the hushed aisles of a rare bookstore, the scent of old paper and ink a soothing balm on her soul. She had built a world of gentle routines and small joys, a fragile peace constructed on the foundations of a dark miracle. But his absence was a presence in itself, a silent room in the architecture of her heart. She never spoke his name, not even to herself, yet she felt him in the city's long shadows, in the low hum of a powerful engine, in the sudden, sharp scent of sandalwood on a passing stranger. One crisp autumn evening, she found herself at a charity auction held within the grand, echoing halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She had come with her boss, a kind elderly man who had insisted she attend. Surrounded by priceless art and the city's philanthropic elite, she felt a strange sense of dislocation. This was a world of polished surfaces and performative grace, not unlike the one she had stumbled into that fateful night. As she stood before a vast canvas of swirling, melancholic blues, she felt a familiar chill, a sudden drop in the room's temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She knew, even before she turned, that he was there, a ghost made of flesh and shadow. He stood across the gallery, a figure of absolute stillness amidst the fluid motion of the crowd. He was a void in the light, his dark suit absorbing the soft glow of the chandeliers. His face, as severe and controlled as she remembered, showed no sign of recognition, yet she felt his gaze like a physical touch. It was not the intense, assessing look of their first encounters, but something heavier, weighted with the silence of the intervening year. In that single, suspended moment, the noise of the auction, the murmur of conversations, and the distant melody of a string quartet all dissolved into a profound, humming silence that existed only between them. He was a king in his kingdom, and she was a mummery he could not exercise. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the gallery's entrance. A young woman, clearly distressed, was accusing a well-dressed man of stealing her wallet. The man scoffed, his voice loud and dismissive, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. Security was slow to respond, the scene curdling into an ugly, public spectacle of privilege and powerlessness. Clara watched, her heart clenching with a familiar sense of injustice. But then she saw it.
a subtle, almost imperceptible signal from Julian, a slight tilt of his head. One of the men standing discreetly behind him detached from the group and moved with silent, predatory grace. He intercepted the thief, retrieved the wallet, and returned it to the woman with a quiet word, all before the official security even understood what had happened. Julian's eyes never left her during the entire exchange. The act was not for the crowd or for the victim. It was a message sent across the polished marble floor directly to her. It was a silent demonstration that his nature had not changed, but its purpose had. He was no longer just a predator. He had become a silent, ruthless guardian, his power a dark, invisible shield against the world's casual cruelties.
He was imposing his own brutal order on the chaos, not for profit or power, but because the memory of her quiet defiance had irrevocably altered the moral calculus of his soul. He had seen innocence, and now, in his own dark way, he was compelled to protect it wherever he found it. He gave her a single final nod, a gesture so small it was almost lost in the vastness of the room, yet it landed with the weight of a benediction. It was an acknowledgement, a release, and a farewell. Then, with a discipline that must have cost him everything, he turned and walked away, his men falling into formation around him, a moving wall of shadow that swallowed him whole. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind only the cold, empty space where he had stood. Clara felt the invisible chain that had bound them together for so long finally, gently dissolve. He had saved her one last time, not from danger, but from himself, setting her free to live in the light he could never share. A profound, bittersweet peace settled over her, quiet and deep. She was no longer the girl in the stained uniform, and he was no longer just the monster in the shadows. They were two souls who had collided in the dark, and in the wreckage had found a strange, painful, and beautiful form of grace. She reached into her purse, and her fingers brushed against the worn leather spine of an old book of sonnets, the ghost of a gardenia still clinging to its pages. Some stories don't end with a shared tomorrow, but with the quiet understanding that a single act of courage can redeem even the darkest of hearts. If you believe that even a flicker of light is worth fighting for, like this video and share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what you think her future will hold.